it's on mute. Stop. All right. There we go. Welcome. Good morning. Trust everyone's had a great holiday so far. Thank you for being here today. My name is Margarita Rose, and we're here today to coming back home to you at the holidays. And our topic this week is vulnerability. And I think vulnerability gets a crap shoot. People, for me anyway, in the beginning, when I talked or thought about what vulnerability meant and how society views it, it almost feels like it's a stigma. It's a weakness. It is a sign that you don't have your stuff together. And a lot of the times we also feel scared to be judged and criticized by speaking our truth and being vulnerable and sharing what is in our hearts. And one of the things going through the leadership training and doing personal development as we've had, we realize that when feedback is neutral and we see it and view it as a gift, as a way to grow and expand, because it's not necessarily what's wrong with you, it's just this is how you're showing up. If this is who you want to be, cool. If not, shift. And it was such a blessing and almost like a freedom that it provided for me. And I was just like, oh my gosh, it's such a blessing because now I see how I'm showing up in the world and I get that why I was getting, like friction coming back to me because it was necessarily, I wasn't speaking my truth. I wasn't being honest about, where I was. And so because of that, all the energy was talking, but the words were saying other things. And so people were picking up on the energy and they're like, your words aren't matching what I'm feeling. And so once I shifted that, I've noticed that there's more harmony in my life, or I should say, there's harmony in my life. And there's also a space that gives people permission to do the same. And it's getting to the point where I'm starting to really understand the people around me on a level now that there's so much compassion because I'm recognizing, wow, those people are just like me. They also have the same insecurities. They have the same fears. And so it was through that work that I realized, oh, the importance of vulnerability. And Brene Brown, there's a few of her quotes that I love. But one of the things that comes up when we talk about being vulnerable is a lot of anxiety because it's the not knowing what's going to happen, right? Because you're responsible for your actions, but you're not responsible for the outcome. Like you have no control over the outcome. And so one of the things that she talks about is the feeling of anxiety, right? Anxiety is the most contagious emotion out there. Like, have you guys heard of that crazy? I forget what it's called, but it's like the wild crazy syndrome where it's like one person starts to have like a full-on panic attack and it's like the crazy, everybody else starts kind of going on the same. So it's interesting how energy can really be that shifts people. But she also talks about calmness. Being calm is also as equally as contagious. So at this holiday, one of my challenges for myself is just staying calm in the moments when it feels like the ish is hitting the fan. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? And so for me, my question to you guys is, uh, what is vulnerability? Have you found yourself being vulnerable? Was there a moment in your life where a vulnerable situation arose that called you to action? And what was the outcome? Anybody want to share?
I can go, Margarita. You mentioned something about intimate. Vulnerability is intimacy. My pastor likes to say, "Into me, see." When you're vulnerable, you're letting people see something that others may not see. And being a leader, being a wife, being a parent, I think we're all vulnerable at some point. You know, being a leader, you may be put in situations and you're not sure if you're making the right decision. And you have to be vulnerable and you have to be strong and calm in those times. As a parent, you don't know if you're ever doing the right thing. and you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable with your kids. I think we're probably a lot more vulnerable with our kids than maybe our spouses. And I think that's because we assume there's an unconditional love that exists that we're not as comfortable in with our own relationships. So I think for me, being vulnerable and intimate and allowing somebody into me to see is very vulnerable. And because of that, I have, my friends that are my friends, they're really tight because of that, because you give something of yourself.
I love that. I love what you said about intimacy because it's true. I found myself in one of my breakdowns at the holidays, as I think for me is a norm now. Well, up until now it was. And this time around, I really wanted to go in and not be just surface, right? Because that's the game I'm up to now. It's like, okay, well, I'm seeing this is not working for me. I'm risking losing my family and my marriage and my respect, my own self-respect and dignity and all those things that come into play. But it's interesting how when you've been doing something for so long, it just becomes automatic pilot. And then when you find yourself in that situation, you're like, oh, I had a blind spot. What happened? How did I get here? And so it was me really going in deep and being vulnerable with myself about what was my trigger. Is it what's my blind spot? And I couldn't figure it out on my own. And it was so great that I reached out to my coach, who's here right now, Henry, and I reached out to my mentors and a friend of mine from my buddy, and everybody was just giving me coaching and just helping me see. They weren't telling me what to do. They were just asking questions, and it was allowing me to go in and seeing like where is my blind spot. And what showed up for me was that I was holding on to my story with dear life, that identity that I've had for so many years. And I was like, but I want to get rid of it. Why am I holding on to it? That makes it's like counterintuitive. Like, what do you mean? But it just goes to show you how strong we hold on to something we know is not good for us because it's a part of our identity. And we also don't know because we're not willing to really get vulnerable with ourselves to see what it looks like to make a different choice. And so that's where I found myself today. And I was like, wow, what a great topic to talk about because vulnerability can mean so many different things. Is there anybody else who wants to share like what comes up for you about that topic?
Yeah, so for me, that vulnerability was really the beginning of my healing. It was the end of me bottling everything up. And it was also just the beginning of me not bottling things up. It wasn't everything all at once. But yeah, it's like you can't, if you won't admit that you, like, if you have a cut, if you have a wound, if you have, gaping, oozing, pus-filled ick, you can't heal it properly. And that was like just sharing and being open with people, like, this is what I'm going through. That was the start of my path to finding healing that was effective.
You want to share a little bit more about your healing journey? Because I know you and I talked a little bit about it, and I think it's a great, it's something that I don't think a lot of people feel comfortable talking about, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So I think
it's
it's really important nowadays to really step forward and model what it looks like to be vulnerable in those kinds of situations.
yeah. So 18 months ago, I had a miscarriage that saved my life and gave me my voice back. And I I had been losing myself for years. I had juvenile depression that started when I was 10, and that continued on into just like the just recent years. I've been still coming out of that, but I got married roughly in the middle of that depression, and to a man who I didn't realize actually reflected my depression back to me, and we actually had the effect of amplifying that. I got pregnant pretty quickly after we got married, and that was actually that was how that was when I made the decision to stop self-harming, which was mild. It was never a, a serious issue, but I started taking care of myself in a different way for the sake of the children that I was carrying. So but in other ways, I started neglecting other parts of myself. I saw that just the obedience of being a wife and mother and to the exclusion of pretty much everything else. It was with every child. It's like, I have four daughters, and I'm pregnant with my fifth child. It was with every child. It's like, this is it. I don't have the luxury of having anything else in my life. And I started praying for that God would just take away the desire to do anything that I had previously loved before motherhood, before marriage, so that I could devote myself wholeheartedly to my children. But um, I also became so closed off, so numb to my children, so callous even to my children, because I lost who I was in all of that process, that I wasn't an effective mother anyway. So I felt very, very much conflicted between, like, I need to be a good wife and mother, but I also need this. I need to actually be me. And I basically until 18 months ago, I miscarried about 18 months ago. And my mother has said that up until that point, she watched me commit personality suicide, and she felt like I was actually dying slowly. I mean, that was something that my brother had actually experienced too. I had sent a picture about 6 years ago where his feedback was that I looked like a cancer patient. I was 26 at the time, and I looked gaunt. So after the miscarriage happened, that was a wake-up call. For one thing, it showed me where my heart was. And I wanted to be with this child. It was probably a blighted ovum. It was a very early miscarriage. I've said multiple times, this is probably one of the most kind miscarriages any woman could go through. It was very quick. There weren't complications. The stress was what got me. And I passed out, and my husband thought I had a seizure, and I threw up everywhere, and he took me to the hospital. I didn't have a seizure. It was just, they told me how to like rehydrate. Like, this was not worth however much that stupid visit cost. But after that, I started sharing with people in my life. And this was the first pregnancy that I hadn't shared that I was pregnant. And so there was an aspect where I was forced into being vulnerable about the fact that I had just suffered that, because people didn't even know, but they were going to pick up on my anguish. And it was startlingly freeing to me at the time. When I started sharing, I found out like just how many times some of my closer acquaintances or friends had similar experiences. Like, they'd had so many, like, in a couple cases, like, I don't even know how, like, they didn't know how many miscarriages they'd had. And it's just this whole world opened up to me of support and vulnerability. And it was strange. Like, I started to enjoy, I wasn't healing exactly yet, but I did start looking like, okay, this is my opportunity to actually take care of myself in a deeper way. I mean, I was neglecting my physical needs. I mean, having babies so close together really does take a toll physically as well as emotionally. So I started looking for help. I knew therapy. I'd done therapy before, and it wasn't particularly helpful. But that was when I started to find coaching. I found coaching a little bit under a month after the miscarriage. And that was where, and I started very surface level. I started purging clutter and getting sort of the surface. It's like I started from the outside in terms of my environment, but it was still working on my thoughts. So seeking wise counsel was a huge part of that. And counsel, like coaching and counsel, are different things, but they're related. Just finding someone who is healthy and is going to give you that neutral feedback or sound advice in some cases. But even after I even signed up to become a coach, within 3 months of finding coaching, like, okay, I'm seeing how this is benefiting me. I know that my journey is just beginning, but I became a coach. But then I was seeing, okay, I'm feeling resistance in me. I'm not feeling as coachable. I started pouring in more to my being a coach than my being coached. And when I did get coached, I was feeling resistance. And I was noticing when I was practicing my skills on my mother, who has PTSD just from childhood trauma. It's very complicated when it's from childhood. But she would go into, she couldn't verbalize what was going on, and I realized there was an inner child problem thing going on where she couldn't verbalize what was going on, from what I was asking her. And the client that a client that I've worked with for now a year, she would have a similar issue, and I knew she had significant inner child conflict. So I started praying for a solution that would support them, almost like EMDR that's used in therapy, but I knew I couldn't use that because that's very controlled, and there can be risks with that. So that was my introduction into breath work, transformational activating breath work. It ticked so many boxes that I'd even forgotten about. Like when I was in the height of my depression, I'd researched using psilocybin mushrooms in microdosing. But I was never actually brave enough to try it because I'm very straight-laced and I've never done anything remotely illegal or
I see
bordering on
that.
illegal. So the idea that this this is one of the effects of breath work that it gives, like the brain creates similar chemicals to psilocybin mushroom and DMT. So it releases, it just creates an experience where you can release those things, and it actually changes your brain chemistry. So it ticked all of these boxes. So my introduction to breathwork was me signing up to become a breathwork coach, which is like just like jumping in with both feet with blindfold, not actually knowing where you're jumping. um,
Well, it goes to show your dedication for your willingness, right? You're like, I'm ready, and there's something's got to give. And you
yeah,
knew that it was up to you to do it. And so kudos to
yeah.
you for going in there and jumping in. I think that's what got me here today. I just finally jumped in too. Anyway, go
Hmm.
ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. So that um that was really what gave me the final piece of what gave me the space to heal. Because with breath work, one of the big things was you don't have to talk. Like if you don't want to talk about it, you don't have to. All you have to do is feel, you release in private. No one has to hear you scream and cry and swear and see all of the snot and gunk that just comes out sometimes, and hear the spontaneous screams of just the body releasing so much pain. I did 4 sessions. I did 4 days in a row where I did a session each night, and I didn't know what I was doing at the time, and I ended up with leg cramps and like severe tetany, which is lobster claws, so to speak. The body freezes up because of the gas exchange, and I was out of my depth. And as a musician, if I would force air out, and that was very much not in my favor in this. That was what was causing the tetany. But it did give me a powerful release that I didn't know that I needed, and that it prompted extra screaming. There's scream therapy in breath work. And but yeah, the leg cramps, like there was one journey that I ended up screaming, I think 25% of it, instead of just like the little program, like, okay, we're gonna just have a scream. It's just I can't stop. This is awful. So that was a different experience. Um but yeah, so that's going through all of that. I realize that this is, if we don't release, the stuff that's deep under the surface. Like the coaching that we do, it's really just coaching over crap. And we need that release in order to be coachable, in order to have growth. So
Yeah, I love what you're sharing, Beth. What a great story to share for how you got to where you are. Because one thing I've noticed too, with breath work is you don't really need to know what the core
no.
thing is. It just brings it out. And that's the beauty of
Yeah.
breath work. And I think that that's one of the things I found myself in this week. I was like, I don't know what my trigger was. What was it that got me here again? Right. And I'm like thinking it to death. And sometimes you can think it to death, but it could be just a trauma that wasn't even that would happen in utero when
Yeah.
or something else completely not associated with me. And that's one thing that I
Mm-hmm.
love. Um, but yeah, last week I had my friend here, Jen, who's here today, do a breath work for us. And I found myself
Mm-hmm.
like my lips were tightening.
Yeah.
It was like I was feeling my hands a little bit. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so weird. And I got really
Mm-hmm.
cold and shaky and I was crying. I don't know what I was crying about, but it just felt,
Yeah.
I felt like just a release. And then I was filled up with so much gratitude and
Mm-hmm.
love. And it was such a beautiful space to be in. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I get to do this every day.
Yeah.
And so thank you for sharing about the importance of breath work in helping to move that needle when you feel like you've gone as far as you can and you don't know where to go. Maybe breath work is your key, guys. So I encourage everybody to try breath work. So one thing you really have control over is your breath.
Mm-hmm.
And your breath is connected to your emotions, as we talked about last week.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
it's
So
interesting. Actually, in the Bible, there's sort of a funny passage that the direct translation is the kidneys are the seat of the emotions. And it's usually mistranslated because that doesn't make sense to a lot of like emotional talk. But the adrenals sit on top of the kidneys, and the adrenals are what drive our emotions. So when our adrenals are on overload, um, they they are yeah, we're
well, that's why a
dysregulated.
lot of people have lower back pain because their
Uh-huh.
adrenals. When you have lower back pain, I invite you to consider if you're stressing out all the
Yeah,
time.
absolutely.
Uh, yes, thank you, Beth.
Yeah.
I love that. So vulnerability for me in being just honest with those people, right? In the moment that comes up, hey, like after I had this complete breakdown, I came up and in front of my mother-in-law, my children who are 11 and 12, my husband, and this woman who is like his second mother, right? And I love and adore this woman as well. They were sitting at the dinner table and I came and I expressed the ways that that were coming off selfish and being not responsible for my actions and acknowledging that I have a problem and that I was recommitting to myself and the work and to my family. And in that moment, I was being vulnerable, but what was shared for them is they saw me as being courageous. And that's one thing that I love to hear Brene Brown say is that vulnerability is an act of courage, not an act of weakness. And when we can start seeing it that way, it would empower us to just step in and lean into it and go, hey, how can I create connection? Well, a lot of the times it's just being vulnerable and and speaking your truth and being, hey, I'm worried that if I say something or if I speak on this or if I tell you how I feel about it, that you might think differently of me or you might think that I'm attacking you. But it's important, like it, and you just say it. It's almost like you're narrating your truth before you speak it. And that's what vulnerability to me sounds like. It's just prefacing like, hey, this is where I am right now in this moment of wanting to share my and being honest with you. And when people can hear that, it puts them in a place of, okay, let me hear you instead of just let me judge you. So when you set the stage that way, I think it really helps to encourage connection. And that's, I think, a lot of the things that we are just struggling with and wanting. We just want to be connected to someone and feel deeply with them in all vulnerability. How much more connection and love I'm experiencing from my husband since I've come to him with my truth and saying, "Hey, babe, I get it. I get it. Up until now, this is how I've been showing up. And I'm scared. I'm scared that you still have so much resentment. I'm scared that you're still seeing me in the light of the judgment." I go, but and I feel like it's hard for me to really show up in my truth because you're still seeing me in with the veil of my past. And that's hard. And when I speak that, he's able to express to me how he feels. And then I get to listen and hear him in his vulnerable space. Because I'm sitting here thinking I have all this stuff, but he has his insecurities too. He has his own beliefs that are stressing him out or making him not feel good enough or worthy or what have you. And so what he and I went and had dinner night, a date night that I said no to the first time we were supposed to go because I was having my selfish run. And it was almost perfectly timed that way. We had a beautiful night. There was a eerie mist down in the by the ocean. But we went to 5 different places, and each place we were just spontaneously being ourselves. And it felt really good for the first time in a long time, where it felt like we were our younger versions of ourselves without children in that moment. Even though we talked about our kids often, but I even heard a story from him that I had never heard before. I was like, 24 years later, I'm still hearing a new story. And I was being very playful. I was being silly and goofy and making him laugh and razzing him. And it was the most perfect, perfect, perfect night. And it was because I allowed myself to be vulnerable too, right? He's like, oh, I feel like I've ruined the opportunity from last week, but I get a chance here and I get to show up vulnerably and saying, hey, I'm going to be silly. Don't laugh at me. I'm going to say something off the wall. I was saying things off the wall, but I was allowing myself to be vulnerable in this space of saying, hey, you already know all sides of me and you still choose to stay with me. So I'm going to double down with my silliness and my goofiness and bring in the joy and bringing the joy. So, I just want to invite anybody else if they had anything that came up for them on vulnerability, an instance where they felt that they chose that and it created connection, or a moment that they felt they wanted to and that they couldn't. And like what did that create? Like, is there anybody who has like a juxtaposed story to share about vulnerability and how it just blew up in your face? And then why? Like my coach is like, yeah, you're funny, Margarita.
No, I love it. I just didn't know, like I'm here as a viewer and watching this and the experience and everything. And it's like I hear about vulnerability, and of course, Margarita, with the coaching that we experienced this past week, like vulnerability is major. And I love the fact that you're talking about it because I believe it's tied into the subject that we talked about last week, with authenticity. And I hear vulnerability, and I drop into vulnerable moments, and it comes through as authenticity. So I think vulnerability is a tool of authenticity that creates connection. I think that vulnerability can become an expression of freedom, which can lead to accepting yourselves, because acceptance is love. Like my great friend Patrick Hoffman says, that acceptance is love, and learning to love yourself. And I think while vulnerability may be an outward expression in most cases, it's a cathartic experience for your inner child or your inner being, really saying what's been on your mind for a while that you haven't felt you've been in a safe place to say. So it's like when you go into this mode of vulnerability, of complete authenticity, anchored in honesty, you're giving a person the most important parts of yourself without even with fear. And when you do that and you have that exchange with somebody, it can create a bond and a connection for life, like you and your husband, Margarita. Like I can just see it as it's something that's it's not used enough in this world. Everybody feels like they got to put on a show, like they got to put on an image, they got to have the perfect, you know, environment or background, whatever it is. We're all in our own heads trying to think that we know what everybody else is thinking, but we can't think what everybody else is thinking because we don't know what we're thinking because our phones and everything else distracts us. So it's like when we anchor into vulnerability, it's probably going to be the most freeing part of your day because you're going to express and you're going to see, that it's okay, that other people feel the same way you do too. And when you share your pain and your promises that fell short, or your perspective of how tough things may be in your life, it's an experience that you want to get every single day because it'll lead you to being authentic and showing up in your true form every single day, which will be an expression of freedom. And you will not have another day where you feel in that prison where you can't be vulnerable and you can't say who you truly are. So vulnerability to me is like one of the gateways into the true free expression of yourself and knowing yourself in your whole entire life's journey. So it's like anybody watching this vulnerability, if you've been struggling with being able to say and share with somebody else, just listen to the testimonies and the stories that when somebody shared, it was the most powerful experience in their life and they actually made a friend. So yeah, thank you for allowing me to chime in, and I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you. I love what you said. Vulnerability is a tool for authenticity, and it is a path to freedom. It really is a path to freedom. I know I feel free. I feel free because it was almost like a dirty little secret that I had, even though I wasn't doing anything wrong, right? It was just me being in my own insecurities and stuck in my own story of um, what I once believed about myself, right? And it was I remember being in a training room and they were all asking us to, if we wanted to, right, to express kind of clearing out that dark closet that of things that were holding you back. And in order for transformation and in order for you to fully fall into your authentic self and being vulnerable, expressing these things and saying them out loud gives you freedom, frees you from the chains that they were holding. I mean, they're like heavy, heavy chains that I was carrying around of burden, right? And it was interesting because like when I said it was not even a big deal, and I realized that there were other people too that were holding on to things. Some things more minor, some things more major, but it was still kind of like, oh my gosh, we're all the same. And that was the biggest thing. And I can't say it enough. That's the biggest thing I've learned through this process is that when we share our truth, we realize how much alike we all are. I don't think I've come across anyone who I haven't related to and said, oh my gosh, I have that too. Or I think that too. Or I've had that insecurity. Oh, I have that fear. Or so many times. And that creates so much love and compassion for other people because you see like, oh my God, they're just like me. And when I lived 8 days of bliss going through this process, I had this little boy hug me. And it was a factor of many things. It was where my mind state was. So I was going through this, like really going in and listening and being responsible for everything. And it was my husband and my daughter standing next to me. So they were also in my energetic sphere, right? And this little boy comes up to me and wants to give me a hug to thank me for reading a story time. But he was so cute. He was just like encroaching onto me. And I was like, you want a hug? He's like, yes. And then I hugged him. And it was probably his energy signature as well that was just instantly healing because I felt a breaking open of my heart. And then I went to the store and I decided to keep on this like the little mask that I was wearing when I was reading the Day of the Dead story. And I went to the grocery store and I shifted this guy's grumpy mood. And he was like, you know, I was really grumpy. And then I saw you and it made me smile and I don't feel grumpy anymore. Thank you. I was like, you're welcome. You should smile. It's gorgeous. And I'm glad I could be of service. And so I'm in the grocery store and people are just like, oh, and then I see people smiling coming by. And it was just really elevating my own emotional state. I felt I was like on cloud nine. It's so much so that I was like, I want to go live and share it with my friends. Like, this is amazing. Like, look at how powerful I am just showing up in my truth and being vulnerable to have like this mask and be, I'm like wearing this mask. It's not even Halloween. And, it's like, who's this adult woman with this, like, I didn't care. In that moment, I was like, I'm just in a joyful state. And it helped shift so many people. And you know what? That created, and then after that, I found myself having such an expansive heart and compassion. Nothing could trigger me. Not my 11-year-old daughter, not my husband, who's the best at knowing all my triggers, not my child, not my son, not the people who cut me off the road don't trigger me anymore. I don't get triggered by traffic anymore. I sing and I'm in my own little bubble. I always see it as if there's traffic, it's slowing me down from having an accident. So I'm cool with that. Like that's how I see it anyway. And it was interesting because what I was able to do is to see them in their vulnerable child hurt state who also just wanted to be seen and heard. And I was just like, this is so beautiful. It has such love for everything and everyone. And then I found it, I started feeling it going away. And I was like, found myself going, no, don't go, this, don't go. But what that allowed me to do was like, it's attainable and I know what it feels like. And even though I don't feel like I'm on that cloud nine, I know what compassion looks like and feels like and how to have an expansive heart where I get to see people in their 6-year-old hurt self, just like I want to be seen. It's not this armor I'm wearing that is who I am. It's the person I'm protecting here that is. And I think a lot of the times because we're not being honest and authentic and vulnerable about that, people see us as bitches or, oh, he's a jerk or, oh my gosh, this guy this or this girl that. And it's like, no, I'm just protecting myself. I've been hurt too many times and I'm scared. I'm scared that you won't like me if you know my truth. I'm scared that I'm not good enough if I cop to these things that make me feel not good enough or that I messed up. I made a mistake. And so therefore I have the scarlet letter for the rest of my life. It's like, no, we all make mistakes. We're human. It's what you do with it that really shows your character. What you do with that mistake and how you come back from it. And it's also being vulnerable in that moment. Hey, vulnerability says, hey, I recognize I made a mistake. I see how I hurt your feelings. I see how I'm responsible for showing up this way for you. And I'm sorry. I see you. Right. And then being vulnerable too is telling somebody you love them. Being vulnerable is also telling somebody what you really think about them. Especially if it's not on a positive light, because you see their greatness, but you see them showing up not in their best. And that takes courage and vulnerability to come up to someone and say, hey, Henry, I love you. But dude, like what's going on? Like, this has been my experience of you this week. Like, what's happening? Are you okay? Not coming from judgment, not being like, hey, you've been an ass. Right? Coming from a place of I love you. And I see that like this is out of character, or this is starting to affect how I'm perceiving you. Like you said that about perception of life. And it's so true. It's all our perspective. And a lot of times we assume we know instead of just asking the person, instead of just being, hey, I love you, man. You're being a jerk. Starting with the I love you first really does soften the blow. Just so you know, I speak from experience. I can handle constructive criticism well if I know it's coming from a space of love and care. Like you care for me, not that you're trying to make me wrong. But when you're just going to come at me and attack me and point out all the things that where I'm wrong or why I did something wrong, I'm going to put up the walls. I'm not going to allow myself to be vulnerable to hear you, right? Like if anything, I'm being vulnerable too much without it being a place of integrity for me because I want to run and hide. I want to run and hide. I want to say, you're wrong. You don't know me. I'm never understood. That was always been my story. Nobody understands me. Well, because no one ever actually heard me speak my truth. I was speaking around it because I was still protecting my, like, I didn't want people to judge me. I was still like saying I was speaking my truth, but like keeping something back here, which was really my truth. And so what happens is it creates distrust. People don't trust me because they know I'm probably holding something, or I say something that it doesn't really align with my truth, and so it comes off not what I meant to. Comes off. People interpret it as like, is that what you really meant to say? Have you guys ever experienced that, Sarah? Yes.
Yeah, it was when you're speaking just there, something just kind of like really caught my attention. And you said that you were being too vulnerable. So I wanna ask the group here, can you actually be too vulnerable? Is that really a thing? Or is it more like my experience of being too vulnerable, I think, is more so found in being uncomfortable with my level of vulnerability. And because of the leadership container we're currently in, I've realized that I also have that by being vulnerable, at the end of vulnerability is transformation. So I'm curious to hear what other people think. Like, is being too vulnerable, is that really a thing, or is it something else?
I like the question. Is it a story?
Uh,
Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out. Anybody have any quick
I think
thoughts
I'll
that
jump
come up
in
for
there.
them?
I think I'll jump in there. I don't know if you could be too vulnerable, but I think being vulnerable at the right time with the right message is the key. Because, I may be a leader and I may have 70 employees, but I'm not going to go and tell all those employees that I've been raped. I'm not going to go tell all those employees that I'm in a domestic violence situation. I'm not going to tell all those, there's certain things you share and there's certain things that you don't. If I have an employee that's going through something and I can help them through my own experience, then that's the time. But they don't need to know my whole life story at that, I don't need to put it all out there. There's a time for it. And I think knowing when and how to listen and communicate and really get that message across. Sometimes maybe they don't even need to know my story. Maybe they just need to know that I can empathize with them. So I think actively listening and responding in the moment, I think is the most important.
Yeah, I love what you said. When you bring it up about it being in the workplace, brings up a whole great point about vulnerability in the workplace. Like, one in the book that I shared earlier, Brene Brown's Dare to Lead, she really does talk about creating a safe container within the business where it's rumbling with vulnerability. And it's funny because when she first talks about in the book, it's like these people didn't want to share anything because they were worried that it's a failure. I failed. You're gonna see, look down on me and what didn't work. And it's like when she talked about it being a container of just feedback and what wasn't working and just to shift that, it allowed people to be vulnerable with their thoughts about something that maybe they were going against something that she had done or said. but she creates this really safe place for people to say, hey, yeah, I realized that we were supposed to do this one thing and it didn't work out, and this is what didn't work. This was what wasn't working about that. And it gives people the freedom to come in really with an open, loving heart of saying, what an opportunity for us to refine our messaging, as opposed to it being like a dump all, like finger pointing situation. So I want to ask you, Cindy, since you brought it up, like, is that something that you find that you practice in your business or aspiring to, or how do you feel people react to you, coming to you when they might not be getting the job done?
It's funny. I do a perception management training, and I have people, I'm also past military, so I know chain of command. I know a lot of those things. And I have some people that are really chain of the command. They won't go or come to me if they're feeling something until they talk to the manager, which is perfect, the way it should be. But there's still some that have that stigma of, I'm never going to go to her. And, we go through trainings, we do a lot of events, and they'll be like, I had no idea I could just come talk to you. So they've put their own perception on who they can talk to and who they can't, or how they will be perceived if they've gone here and then went here. My boss is going to fire me because I did this. So I think when people come to talk and they learn and they get past that initial hurdle of what they perceive is going to happen or what that outcome is going to be, they feel relieved and they feel stress-free. Is it always good for me? No, but I'm always grateful. I mean, I've had some that get so comfortable that they may text me, ping me all hours of the day and night. And, then you've got to have a different conversation about boundaries, but I'm always grateful. I'm grateful that people can come to me. I'm grateful that I can listen and I can be there. But those are all based on other people's perception of outcome. And that's something that they have to really figure out themselves. Where did that stem from? And why do they feel that way?
Thank you for sharing that. So I go back to the question, is it more, can somebody be too vulnerable? I love that you're asking that because it's still sitting with me. I'm like, can I be too vulnerable? No, I think it's either vulnerable or not vulnerable. Go ahead, Henry.
No, yeah, like too vulnerable. Like we think about it when we hear it back. In my experience, it doesn't make sense, but it does make sense in the world, like how Cindy touched in military and with men. Like there is such a thing as being too vulnerable. Like, and it's a stigma and it's incorrect and it's something that doesn't serve us as men in a major way because being too vulnerable. It's like, oh, hey, bro, like I I'm fighting off tears because I'm here at work and I'm showing up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm here, but I'm in tears because of my last exchange with my wife. I don't think we're gonna make it, and I'm fucking vulnerable right now. I feel like crying. We can't do that. It's too vulnerable. But to come in and be like, oh, she was tripping again, dog. Like, oh yeah, hey, like this is jacked up. Like I'm really hurt right now, and like I don't even want to work, bro. Can you just like really work for me? Like that's the vulnerability that's accepted between men typically in the workplace or in any type of relationship. It's very surface level. Going too vulnerable is something we hear all the time. You're being too vulnerable, man. You're being too vulnerable. You're being too vulnerable. And it's like we get conditioned in this stuff as men getting older to where it really puts handcuffs on us to when we have these relationships with mature women like yourselves to be able to be too vulnerable and understand that this is accepted in this space and it's actually what's required to have a fruitful, loving, intimate relationship where we can really see each other and know what each other's experience in life is going like for each other. So it's like, yeah, too vulnerable is something that should be encouraged in the male community for people to be too vulnerable because we don't understand. A lot of us in our journeys don't even understand what that means. It's like I told you my problem. My wife made me upset and now I don't want to work and focus. And it's like, no, bro, you're actually hurting and you're in sadness and you may not be able to see your kids and you're thinking about not seeing your kids, and you're worried about what your mom's going to say, or you're worried about what your dad's going to do, or he's just going to tell you to stick it out, like you don't have any support, that being too vulnerable is almost illegal. It feels like it's an illegal, like you pay a price for it. And it's just like, I just like to be the only, since I'm the only male in here at the moment, just bring that little element in there that too vulnerable is something we deal with all the time. It's a major block when it comes to building relationships between us men and really getting to know each other and understand that we are, in my experience, if not more emotional than women, because we hide it and it stores up in us. And when it comes out like a rain of fire, thunder sometimes, it usually, or a big sobbing, crying mess. It's usually has an extreme attached to it. So it's like, if I could say anything to take away from what I just said, is that women get to create a space for men to be able to be too vulnerable, because we need the invitation. We need the constant invitation. We get to have the constant invitation. We get to have the constant, and it may take us years, get the help of a coach like Margarita, Cindy, Jen, and Sarah, and we'll be able to, and you'll be able to support. But it's like, yeah, I think about that stigma and it makes me sick, because it kept me trapped for so long, because I wasn't thinking that I could be too vulnerable, or I was being too vulnerable. And now, like we know in these leadership containers, like it's encouraged. And like I mentioned earlier, I've learned that it's really about connection, and it's not about controlling things and having all the pressures to provide and protect and perceive what everybody else is going through. It's a lot. And I think that, yeah, too vulnerable needs to be eliminated, but it also needs to be acknowledged that it is something that happens in this world. We just can't put it away. Being too vulnerable is something that we get to work out.
Rita, do you mind if I ask a follow-up question to when we talk about vulnerability and kind of that intimacy? I think women it's a lot easier for us to be intimate with each other. But do you feel that guys could have that same intimacy with, I know guys that are really, really close friends. Do you think they could have those same type of intimate relationships as women, or do you still feel that is just not the case?
No, it's not. Yeah, I'm just speaking on it. Thank you, Cindy, for that, because I'm not thinking that it's too vulnerable is something not to deal with. Yeah, I think that. Hold on. Okay, so women being too vulnerable. Sorry, I lost the question. I'm trying to get back to it.
Just the intimacy part of it. I mean, we can have very close, tight,
intimate
relationships with women, but as a man, can you have, or do you have those same types of intimate relationships, or is it always at more of that superficial level?
No, it goes deep. I've taken the steps to join men's group, like I'm in a church men's group where we talk about open and vulnerable feelings all the time. We support each other. If some guy's going through a rough relationship or breaking up or a divorce, like we support emotionally with love and kindness, and make sure to keep them grounded, that they're doing the right things, whether it's from a man aspect or a biblical aspect or both. And I know that in those spaces, in my leadership containers, in the friendships that I've made, and people that experience transformational work, it becomes a norm. That's why I love the transformational space and coaching, because I get to, it's where I serve the best, because I'm a vulnerable person. I'm an authentic person. And I think that men, we do have the capacity. It's such a taboo thing in our world that it's going to take a lot of awareness for us to spread the word that, hey, man, you can share. And I believe, yeah, we can. I know for a fact we have, because I'm a man that has no problem sharing my heart or what I'm feeling in the current moment or the day or whatever it is. And I've found other men that are like that. It's sparing, it's tough, because, you get guys, we tend to be more tribal. Like, you got to know us for a little bit before we can actually, open up to you. But yeah, men, we can. It's already happening. It's just, it's been happening. It gets to happen. And it's only going to get more with how I'm raising, and supporting young men in this world. So yeah, we can. There's hope for us yet.
I love that, Henry. And one of the questions that came up for me that you said about intimacy and providing that container or that safe space for you guys to open and be intimate like that. So what does it look like? Like how can we show up and say, hey, I really would love for you to be know that you can be vulnerable with me. Like, so what is that? What, like, is there, I mean, what would it look like? I'm just curious because I'm like, I'm not gonna be like, hey, babe, can you be intimate and cry in front of me and tell me your truth and be vulnerable? Like, no. So like, what is it what for you anyway, what would it look like for you to be able to open up like that?
Well, if I'm thinking about it and if I put myself back in the situation to where I was before, um, what really got me out of being able, not being vulnerable and being closed off, what got me out of that was awareness. Was that you don't have to be able to solve my problem. Like we know that we really can't solve each other's problems. We can work together, but it's just the awareness that I'm going through something as a man and not thinking that you have to solve it or anything, but I may need you to. So it's like just being there with somebody. Like I always tell people, the most valuable thing is like you can try to answer and solve my problems, but sometimes I just want somebody to sit there with me, to sit there in my mess so I can process it. Because I've been told the first 30 years of my life that I wasn't able to process it. So it's like the best thing I think if for a man is in most cases is awareness is a true benefit that helps. It's just noticing it and letting them know you notice it. Like, hey, honey, we're gonna talk about it, but I know you're going through something. And when you're ready, I just want you to know that I see it, and I'm waiting for when you want to talk more about it. Just creating that safe space. Like I think of the analogy, like the kitty cat, the underneath the bed. Like our emotions and our vulnerability are like that little scared kitty cat underneath the bed, and you got to slowly call us out. You got to know we're there. You got to know it's underneath the bed, and it's going to take a little bit of encouragement and awareness. Like I see you. Come on, when you're ready, come on, I'll be right here. It's going to be a good space, just a little bit. Oh, you're almost underneath the bed. You're almost completely out. You're almost to my hands, into my arms. You're almost in my embrace. You're almost in there. Like just having awareness, recognizing it, and allowing us to process it in our own way. Because some men will be like, "Oh, thank you for saying that. Finally, you asked me, honey. Since you asked, ooh, and then you get to throw up." You know what I'm saying? Or it's like, honey, like I am. Thank you. Just you acknowledging that means the world to me. Now I'm gonna go to my garage. I'm gonna listen to some music. I'm gonna do whatever it is. But thank you. And sooner or later, the man typically will go off and do his own thing or find his own way in his process. But the harder ones will sooner or later just from awareness and saying, "Hey, I see you, I hear you, and I stand for you whenever you're ready." And then he'll come around when the right time. There'll be a friend that won't be there to hold him down. There will be where he's gonna have to face it. And knowing that you have that time comes up for him when it's time for him to face it, that he has a safe, loving environment that has been waiting for him, it shifts everything. I'm getting the chills right now just thinking about like the man will fall in love with you like nuts. So ladies, you're having trouble getting a man, like just acknowledge him and be aware of his emotional state, and
Yes.
sooner or later, the second when he needs it, when he really gets to share himself and you have that space waiting for him, that's when you're going to see it happen. So it's like with men being vulnerable relationships, it's a delayed gratification type thing. It's a delayed, to look at how to be able to support a man through his vulnerability. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so interesting how it seems so simple. Like I love how easy it is for us to just show up for you guys. Like if they're not complicated, girls, we make it more complicated. And I think it's the same for us. Would you agree, ladies? It's the same for us. It's creating that space of, hey, I get that you're stressed and I get whatever, whenever you're ready to talk about it, I'm here. And then actually meaning it and listening. Sometimes I feel they're not listening when I'm trying to talk. It's like, oh, because, I don't know if you're like me, like likes to tell the story before the story. And no, but it's like it's so funny that when we are now opening up and having this conversation, how even the opposite sex can start looking not so foreign to us. What he just said was beautiful, and it was like I could do that. That sounds really like doable, and compassionate and loving and beautiful. Like I want to be that for my husband? Have I? And it makes me think, like, have I provided that space for him? And I gotta say, the short answer right now is no, I haven't been. I haven't been because I was in my own crap.
Yeah.
Not allowing myself to be vulnerable and saying, hey, I see you, but I'm scared because I'm also feeling broken. I don't know how to support you, but I see you. Like that alone, Henry, would you say that me saying that alone would be creating
Yeah.
safety and love? Yeah. It's
Yeah.
simple.
Yeah. Yeah.
Simple.
It's a great thing when you can give the man the choice of having to be a protector and a provider and manage all perceptions. When you can give him that option, it's a great step. It's a great step to get out of that mode because we're
Yeah.
constantly in it all the time. And you got to pull us out of it because it's our duty as men to take care of our families. We do get to do that as well, just not in the way that it's been done in decades
Yeah.
and
And
centuries past.
I mean, since we're on the topic of men, I think that sometimes my experience has been that because of what you just said, being the provider and the supporter and protector, that you feel so much weight on you, and then when stress comes, the cure for me would be like being vulnerable and authentic in that moment and saying, "Hey, I'm feeling like I'm not, like carrying my weight right now." And it's really cutting at my ego, or it's cutting at my like feelings of ability to protect my family, and it's showing up in this way because we know how you're showing up for us. It's like, oh my gosh, this guy is being a jerk today, right? So instead of having the wall and being like it's when you open up and you become vulnerable. As a woman become vulnerable in that moment and say, hey, I see you're stressed out. You're taking it out on me. It's not cool. When you're ready to talk about what's really on your mind, I'm here. Because I know it's not me, but it's coming up that way for me. Because
Yeah.
I am here and I'm your wall and I'm your sounding board.
I
Yeah.
just
And
want
I think, go ahead, Cindy. Go ahead.
sorry, I was gonna say I have 4 adult boys, and I have to think as a parent, how much of that do we actually put into play as they're growing up? So,
Mm.
I can remember times when my sons were young and they're like, suck it up, buttercup. Are you bleeding? Or do you have a broken bone? Do you have, and, the dad being, you're too soft on him and him being really hard. So I have to wonder as parents, how much of that do we play into adding to that stigma? How much do we keep them from being vulnerable, and allowing that intimacy? And there's always the mama's boy. But why? As I listen to Henry speak, they need that connection too. So maybe that is why we have those mama boys, and they have the rougher relationships with their fathers because they still need that, and moms are still giving it. But then what are we creating as fathers, husbands, and more into life?
Mm.
Sorry, Henry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
It's a
Oh no,
great
you're
question.
good. That was great. That was great because that's the next step. It's like we go deeper into the root, right? We go deeper into the root cause and the origin of when it all started. And that the only thing I can say about that is that I know as a man and a young man and growing up in domestic violence and drugs and gangs and just bad people that didn't have any character whatsoever, no morals and ethics, just rules. And I think about that as a kid, and I saw, in my perspective, I saw my mom that was struggling. The first woman that I saw that would go through so much in the domestic violence and abuse was my mom. So it developed this, my inner child and me growing up as a man has always been trying to save women. I've been trying to save women by trying to save my mom by saving other women, by thinking that I had to be whatever my father couldn't be to my mom when I was young. When I'm also screwed because it doesn't apply in this day and age anymore. But I know that. And I know that it's led to a lot of toxicity and a lot of codependent and people pleasing and thinking I had to be something other than myself to be able to take care of a woman emotionally, and not to mention all the other stuff. So it's like And I realized that, and it took me a couple long relationships, a lot of, getting my ass kicked to be able to see that I was just trying to save my mom this whole entire time, a lot of inner work. And now that I've freed myself of that, now I'm able to love for real, because I know that love isn't some jacked up hero ideology from when I was a kid, because I can't save my mom. And that was some of the things that, like, I'm getting the children out of this, that I had to understand, is that I can't save my mom. And when I realized that I couldn't save my mom, I realized that I couldn't save the woman that I was with, or women that I've been with. And because it started with such deep rooted issues that I didn't even see. But now I know. So Cindy, I think that, yeah, that's the most impactful place to be able to support young men, is when they're what they see when they're growing up, and what they experience in the safe space that they're given when they're as a kid to be able to go there, or when there's a space created to, like, hey, you're 8 or you're 10 or you're 12, and I'm not going to wait around for you to create this space. Like, we're going to sit here and we're going to learn that part of life is creating a safe space of being able to express whatever you're going through without judgment, so that I can work with you on that and just build a healthy relation dynamic. So it's like, yeah, I may have gone down the rabbit hole a little bit there, but yeah, I can see where that happens.
Yeah, and it's very societally accepted too, like when I was learning energy medicine through Donna Eden, she talks about the radiant circuits and what the circuit breakers are. Circuit breakers are turn that, like stop smiling, stop being so rambunctious. Big girls don't cry. Girls are, be seen and not heard, and all these things that start to break our natural authenticity, our like unbridled enthusiasm of just showing up as us, crying on the moment and then getting over it just as quickly, laughing or getting scared, but then like shifting, right? And all these things that we even hear in the movies, we hear in the commercials, like all this stuff, slowly we don't realize that it's telling us it's not okay as you get older to be unbridled and to have authentic vulnerability in the moment and being able to share from a space of truth. And so yeah, so it's a huge society. It's become a norm, right? And we don't realize that it's eating away at our childhood freedom. And so then we wonder as we get older why we were looking for joy outside of ourselves, and knowing that it actually lives inside and it's a choice. But earlier you were talking about offloading, your offloading strategies, like sometimes you're blowing up and stuff. And that's something I wanted to bring up. I know that um Brene Brown talks about 7 or 6 different ways that people offload their frustration. And the first one she talks about is chandeliering. Like you get so super highly triggered, and then it's almost like jumping to the ceiling in the moment that somebody says something that triggers you, like screaming right away and like just being like very crazy, right? And that what that does is that creates distrust in people for because they're like, oh my gosh, I don't know if this person's going to lose their shit if I say something. And so people start losing respect for you, create cynicism, I think, a little bit too, because it's like that person's just off the wall crazy. And then the second one she talks about is bouncing the hurt, right? Feelings are for the weak, so I'm gonna bounce it off of me. I'm gonna avoid anger. I'm gonna be avoiding of everything. I'm gonna blame others. I'm gonna lash out, shame others. I'm bouncing the hurt. I know I do that. The other one is numbing the hurt.
Yeah.
And the ways that I numbed it is through my addictions and avoiding too. I just avoided it altogether, like numbing it out, just not even thinking about it, running away from it. And another one that I think, Henry, you mentioned was stockpiling. You stockpile the hurt to the point where it's so firmly packed down that your body even starts to shut down. Like you start to actually start experiencing dis-ease in your body from that stockpiling, because you're you're not allowing it to come out and be released into the world. And then she calls one called the umbrage, the tortures who tortures other people by acting like they're peaceful, and like it's the people who come off like goody two shoes, but they're almost condescending, like always positive, like nothing bothers them. They're always on. Like those people drive you nuts, right? And then I think the last one was high centered, fear of getting stuck and how to move forward or even backwards. And so recognizing your emotion. What if I were to lose control? So they feel powerless. So they just want to like do the right thing, right? They're not they don't know how to move forward. They don't know how to, they just get stuck. It's like you get kind of just stuck in it. And I think I don't know if I read any of them that you were like, yeah, I do that. Yeah, I do that. Because like, yep, that's how I deal with my stockpiling. I want to take this time now to bring up my friend Cindy for being here. I know she has something in her heart to share about vulnerability and what it means for her and what got her to where she is. Would you like to share, Cindy? Cindy Meldon?
Um,
All right.
for me, vulnerability really comes from being judgment free. And we were talking about perception earlier. I learned very early on. My dad may not have always been the best. He was an alcoholic. He was a drug addict. He came and went as he saw fit. He would make, comments of, you're this, you're that. Why can't you be this? Why can't you be that? And I was little. I mean, I was like 6, 7. And I very later learned that he was my adopted dad. He wasn't my biological dad, which made a little bit more sense when I was older. He always wanted the son. He eventually got a son, my brother, but he really didn't treat him any better. He just was able to say, I have a son. But going and moving along in life, a lot of those things stick in your head. And my mom, did her very best by us, and I'm very grateful to have her. But one of the things that she always said is, you're not going to please everybody all the time. Everybody is not going to like you. And for those that don't, move on. You are enough for you, and move on. Words were easier heard than to live by. But she would always put herself in situations to prove it. And sometimes those actions may speak a little bit louder than words. And one of the things, we grew up Salvation Army, Red Cross, very, very, my mom hates when I use the word poor because she always provided. We always had what we needed, maybe not what we wanted. So she gets upset when I use the word we grew up with really nothing. But when I look at all my friends and everything they had and what I didn't, it was hard not to compare. But as life progressed, so did she. And she did become very well off. But what she would do and bring me along, I think to prove a point, was she would go to a car lot and she would dress like a bum, a literal bum, just to show how people would interact with her when they thought she had no money and were looking at these vehicles. And then, they would just dismiss her. And then she would go back all dressed up, just so I could see how they would interact with her. And then they would be like, circling her, like wolves to get her business. And, she'd pay for the cars in cash, but she would also already have a car picked out from another lot, but she would just tell them, this is how you treated me, and this is not how I want my future business to be. But really showing me that people have and set perceptions on you without ever knowing you. It really helped shape me and get me out of a place where I always felt judged when nobody was actually judging me. They had their own perceptions of what somebody should look like when they buy a car, what somebody should look like, doing this. So I learned very early on to stand for myself, know what I am. And if others don't like it, that's okay, because I don't have to be liked by everybody. And Is it easy every day under that philosophy? No, it's not. If I have somebody that works for me and leaves, I'm like, did I do something? There's always that thought in the back of my mind. Was it me? Did I do something? When we were talking about people talking to me, one of the things I've always gotten from the people that have left is letters. Thank you. You were that person for me. And if it wasn't for you, I would not have grown. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be in this position. It doesn't mean that I don't ever have those thoughts and feelings, but I'm less likely to fall into it. And I'm always grateful when they do reach back out and let me know what I did do. It boosts, but I also know that I have had employees leave that I'm very grateful left. And personality differences. I've had some employees that I've gotten from other leaders. They're like, oh, I'm sorry you got them. I'm sorry that you're going to have to work with them. For me, I got along with them just fine. And vice versa. I've had staff that have worked for me that we just didn't connect. And they went to somebody else and turned out amazing. So for me, it's a constant reinforcement of you can't please everybody all the time. You're not going to be liked by everybody all the time. And when we talk about vulnerable, I think the most important thing is to be safe being you, because that's the only way you're going to be the best boss, the best parent, the best wife, the best friend, is to be that authentically you, because you can't have a real relationship if you're not authentic, because then you're always trying to remember who are you supposed to be versus who are you. So I think for me, my mom did a great job at really bringing that home for me.
It's beautiful that you had someone to model the society of how, like, I love what you said about even though it's not about you, we still want to make it about us, right? And then what is important to remember, and I think you touched upon that, was that you're not taking it on as your true identity, right? And so when you said be safe being you, I was like, I love that. And I also think for me, I didn't even know who I was. Like, so when it came down to like being authentic to be me, I was like, well, I don't even know who I am anymore. And that was part of the whole battle for me up until now, was that I wasn't getting intimate with myself to really understand who I was, the true me. And if I ever doubted who I am, I just had to go back to who I was when I was 6. She knew who she was. She knew who she wanted to be in the world. She knew what she wanted to do. She knew how she wanted to show up. She knew the kind of friend she was. She knew the kind of friend she wasn't. And it's interesting that I was like, oh, when I went back to going, and when I went back to going back to that 6-year-old that I put away, like I hid behind the wall and I turned off the light and I said, shh, shh. And then I'm sitting here going, I don't know who I am. What's wrong with me? Because I shushed her. I told her, shh, it's my own doing. Like, how often do we create this scenario for us, for ourselves? It's not the world, it's us beating ourselves up and being like, but some of us don't even, there are some of us who don't take the time. They're like, I'm fine with who I am, even though maybe who you are is not the best version of you. Like, how do you know? And it's like, if I know anything about life, it's about expansion and growth and more wisdom and getting, just fully enveloping into the true person that you are, but then doubling down again and then doubling down again, like never coming to a place of, okay, I'm done. I'm done. Like nobody should ever be, I'm done. That's my opinion anyway. I think that if you think that you've already got to a place of greatness, and figure out how much more you could bring it out there. How can you just show up in a way that is more like, if you have everything for you, then how can you give it out? How can you help somebody else if you already have it all? Because that's one way I'm finding myself, my growth, is that I'm doing the healing and then I'm like, oh, I wish somebody had told me it was this hard but easy. And it's just, the bottom line was acceptance. Bottom line, that's what helped me. Just having grace and accepting myself for how I was showing up until now, because I didn't know any better. I didn't have the tools. I didn't have the technique. I didn't have the knowledge. I didn't know what I didn't know.
Well, and I think
And now that
people,
I know it, I wish I didn't, because I was like, oh, I gotta show up now in responsibility and authenticity. I have no excuses now. Go ahead, Cindy.
I think some people lose themselves without even realizing that they've lost themselves. They get into a relationship, maybe with a narcissist, and they just slowly eat away at you day after day after day. And before you know it, you're lost without ever knowing that something was being taken from you. And unfortunately, I've had a couple of those relationships, but also thankfully, because of my background and listening to people saying, how come you don't do this anymore? And I'm like, I don't know. Not even realizing that I had changed, but having friends, I have some really lifelong friends I've known for many, 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 many years saying, what happened to you? Why don't you do this? You used to love doing that. And maybe it was like, oh, you know what? I had the kids, I had games, I had work, I had school, I had whatever excuse I chose to give myself. It was, once again, my excuse and my story. And when I did leave my relationship, I ended up writing a paper, eventually be a memoir about the journey back to me. And it was really going back to finding myself. But a lot of times people don't know that they've lost themselves. It happens over time and they just don't know. So I think a lot of us may be quick to judge. Why did they stay in this relationship? Why did they do this? Why did they do that? And, until you've been in that situation to realize what choices are being made, you don't know. And sometimes that person doesn't know until something, bad or drastic has happened to make them start thinking about it. So
Do you think there's an aspect there too that we think we can change people?
I think there is, Henry was talking about it. He wanted to fix, women. I think there is. If I can help them, if I can prevent this, I don't want anyone else to go through this. But without the right tools, without the right conversation, without that active listening, and if they're not in a space to hear it, it's not going to help.
Right, because they need to want to help themselves first before they can accept it. Right?
Right.
Because I think that's the bottom line. I wasn't ready, even though I told myself I was ready. It wasn't until I'm like, I get to do this because nothing else. I can't do it alone, first of all. I kept thinking I could do it alone. You don't understand. Like I'm very introspective. I really sit there and I digest and like when is it digest? All like what caused me to do this and what was my thinking? Where did it come from? When was the first time I thought that I did that? So like when I got into this leadership container, it was like all the stuff I had already done for myself. Like, what was the trigger? Why do I do that? Oh, okay, I could see that maybe not having a father in my life, and I was trying to, so I've done many, many, many times where I've done that. And I was just like, why am I not getting the needle moving forward? Well, because yeah, a coach can see your blind spots. A coach can see and hear between the lines of what you're saying and what you're not saying. And that's what they're up to, right? And it's not about having the answers or telling you what to do. It's really just getting to the point where they ask you enough questions that you really are unraveling it yourself and you're coming to your own conclusions of like what. And they also will be like, okay, well maybe consider this too. If you didn't get to the pinpoint of it and they had it in their mind and they're like, okay, and maybe consider that this is also something that you're doing. You're like, oh, you're right. Oh my gosh, that's my blind spot. You're not gonna be able to see your blind spot. They're called a blind spot for a reason. And that was one thing that I recognized with having mentors and coaches, that it was like, that's what they're there to see, that your blind spot and what is not and what keeps stopping you. So like journeying back to me was the only time It was the first time that I started to see real, true healing happening in me and in my experiences of my life around me. So that's been beautiful, you know, and it's hard because I think a lot of us, I know for me for a long time, it was hard for me to go in because all I wanted to do was self beat up. It was too vulnerable for me to go inward and really get to the dark spots, the dark places, because I was afraid that I would not like myself. I was afraid of who I would see staring back at me as like, am I fooling? Am I delusional? Am I really fooling myself? Am I not this person I think I am? Right. And so it wasn't until I went in and in full acceptance and love, because I saw me as a 6-year-old and I was able to tell her, hey, I got you. It's okay. I'm sorry. I love you. And I invited her to come into the present with me. And I said, it's okay. You're safe. I have you. I love you. That's all you need. And that's when the healing started for me. Sarah, was there ever a time for you that showed up in a vulnerable place that you really found healing by going inward and really being vulnerable with yourself?
Oh my goodness. Yeah. And Cindy, when you brought up being in like a relationship and how if you're not with the right person, that can really change you and you don't recognize that you've lost yourself. And years ago now, I was in a relationship just like that. I became a totally different person. And I didn't realize it until I developed fibromyalgia. And and fibromyalgia for me was, honestly, I truly believe, is such a blessing. And for anyone that's not familiar with it, it's chronic pain. It's head to toe, full body chronic pain. It is no walk in the park whatsoever. But at first my view was like, oh, why me? And so victim to my illness. And I spent years in that victim state. And then I was like, well, look at everything that this has done for me. And and it's been remarkable, because it was kind of that tipping point that I learned and started to be more vulnerable with myself and with others around me, that and just being open about my illness from the get-go, because I sat and watched my mom go through fibromyalgia but hiding it and suffering through so much pain and knowing that she was in so much pain, and sitting there watching that. And I was like, well, if only she would just tell us, then maybe we'd be able to understand or help out, or it would change our perspective. So when I got my diagnosis, it was vulnerability from the start. It was open and being like, hey, this is what I'm going through. And in support groups that I was in for invisible illnesses, it was so interesting to see that the longer these people had these illnesses, like chronic pain and things like that, the less they were willing to share about it. And the more closed up they were, because people just weren't understanding. And it was really hard. It was really hard for them to be so open and vulnerable and be met with so much hate and blame and shame. And so I was like, no, I get to be open. I get to be open about this. I get to share this. And it starts with me, because fibromyalgia is one of those things that not a lot of people knew about. And I was diagnosed with it 7 years ago, I believe. So I was 20. I was 20. And so people in my sphere didn't know. And then jumping into the leadership container this past year, with HCL just showed me a different side of vulnerability and showed me that even though I am vulnerable, the things that I don't share is my feelings. I'll share the things that have happened to me because that's just my story. That's just life. So I'm open to sharing the things that have happened. But the things that I've struggled with is just sharing how I'm actually feeling. And it's so great, Margarita, that you invited me to speak and on this topic, because I literally just had a conversation with our friend Vanessa last week, and we were talking about vulnerability. And I shared with her that I don't share my feelings. So she asked me to share some of my feelings. And what I thought when I was sharing my feelings, what I thought were feelings weren't actually. She's like, those aren't emotions, Sarah. You're saying how you're experiencing things, but those aren't listing the emotions. And it's interesting because I recognize so many people, including myself, find vulnerability uncomfortable because, and even just the word vulnerability can create discomfort in people, but it creates that discomfort because you're putting yourself out there. You're sharing things. It's a lot to do with our perception as well, right? It's for us, sharing and being vulnerable is sharing those things that are deeper in us that we feel like or might get judgment on and be judged on. And for myself, at least, because I can only speak about myself and my experience, is that when I'm being vulnerable, I'm scared of being judged. And but I also, like, through this experience, and I love the journey that I'm on through self-love and vulnerability and being open and all these things that revolve around this, it's the more that I embrace it and the more that I become comfortable being uncomfortable, at the end of that is transformation, is the person that I want to be. So by going through all these things and constantly working on myself and working on myself in order to be vulnerable, to share how I'm actually feeling, to be open and honest and authentic, that it creates trust, it creates power and so much love as well. And it's a lot of rewriting the script of what we think it is and what we're scared, and just going for it anyways. And
It reminds me of the, oh, what the hell, go for it anyway moments.
that is
When we get the most
my favorite mantra.
uncomfortable. Yes. I love what you said, when you recognize that you were not sharing your emotions, that you were just sharing your experience of it. And what a beautiful way to like word it and to presence it, because that landed for me. I was like, wow, have I been doing that? Have I actually been expressing and being vulnerable with my emotions and connecting with myself and knowing what emotion I'm feeling in the moment? Is it anger? Is it frustration? Is it ridicule? Is it fear? What is it? Like, I think sitting in that and really recognizing is the first step of understanding and getting intimate with what makes me tick. And then
And
getting underneath that emotion, like what caused what, where did the fear come from? Why did I feel fear in that moment? That's the only way to
Exactly.
get underneath that.
Exactly. And for myself, like you shared earlier, Margarita, um, I like to just stuff my feelings down, ignore, avoid them, and, and then they'll come up, and usually in the form of just crying and having like a breakdown when all of a sudden I can't hold it all in anymore. And like I've learned through this process, because I've also been on a journey of loving myself and and taking care of myself and developing that 10 out of 10 relationship, that by recognizing and connecting with my feelings brings me closer in a healthier way to myself as well, because it's being connected, it's allowing those feelings coming up, and it's checking in with myself and just being like, hey, how are we actually feeling? And it's been interesting, because when I've taken those moments to check in with myself, everything just feels so aligned. And and even bigger than that, my pain goes away. My fibromyalgia pain, which is based, like, it's neurological pain, it goes away from like the last couple of days of like breakthrough in HCL to probably when I started PhD. I was pain free. That was 6 months of being pain free, because I was connected with myself, because I was being connected. I was letting my emotions come up and allowing myself to feel the emotions and recognizing and naming the emotions and then looking underneath it. And because of the container that we've been in and the support that we get, it's been safe. And that's something that I kept hearing come up, is having that safety in sharing and being vulnerable, because for myself, I'm scared of being rejected. I'm scared of being wrong. And but now that I know that when I am vulnerable, when I can name my emotions and be connected, it creates pain-free. It creates a pain-free life for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that vulnerability is the key there. And I'm like, okay, well, you know what? I get to embrace this even more, because my vision for my life and my goal for my life of being pain-free is so much bigger than the excuses for not being vulnerable.
Or the story that you want to hang on to, like me, for dear life. It's my identity. It's who I think I am anyway. It's not me. No, I love your share. I love your share. I remember being on a call with you when you kind of made that connection, and it kind of said it here, right? Where she talks about stockpiling and how it creates your body starts to shut down. And that you just said it yourself. You were stockpiling your emotions and your body shut down and it started to not know itself. So it was attacking itself. It wasn't familiar anymore with who it was or what it was. And yeah, when you shared that story of being pain free, I was like, the only thing that changed was, like you shared, being vulnerable and being connected with yourself and going inward and being intimate with that. And guys, I'm telling you, this is the way for healing. The way for healing is not outside of you. The way for healing is inside. You have the answers. You just get to look and be acceptant of your thoughts and emotions. They don't define you. They're not who you are. Just remember, in the beginning, you might be a little scared. You might get a little worried about who or what you'll uncover, but you're safe. And if you don't have a place where you feel safe, find it. Go somewhere. Go like the church circles that Henry was mentioning. There's so many support groups out there for people to have the safe space of vulnerability and sharing. I go to AA and I hear so many people share so vulnerably, right? And a lot of it for people who are like 10 plus years sober, they still their thing is they come in here because an emotion is a trigger. Something, they recognize that there's a trigger for them. And so they come here and speak it so that they can release the hold that it has on them. And sometimes it's just being able to just release that feeling and that fear and that emotion to be freed from it. And I love how you also said what Cindy was talking about is just feeling safe to be you. Like it wasn't until that you felt safe that you started to go in and really going deep. And that's a beautiful thing because you experienced healing. Like, talk about hope for people out there who have been told that there's nothing that they can do for them. When in reality, the choice is within you. And I, as an energy worker, I believe, and as someone who also understands the power of the mind, following people like Joe Dispenza and other thought leaders, there is actually now quantifiable proof that your thoughts affect matter. You could pray in water and change its constitution. You can have two jars and speak hateful words in one and loving words in another, and this one will be beautiful and this one will be black and moldy and disgusting. The power of words. And we are 70% plus water, depends on how old you are, right? Around 70% water. And if we can affect water by our thoughts, imagine what it's doing to you when you're thinking those thoughts about yourself, those negative, hurtful thoughts that we say constantly to ourselves. It doesn't stay in here. Even when you think negative thoughts about somebody, it starts to affect them and it chains them into who is still who they are. Like, it's stopping them from allowing that break, that awareness, that healing that can happen, because you're holding them small. And I think it was something I didn't realize I was doing. I was like, oh my gosh, I do that. I think I'm doing good by not saying it out loud, but I'm still thinking it. I'm still doing just as bad. Because it's also like my energy is also showing my thoughts to this person. So I should just come up and be like, hey, and being honest with them, being vulnerable with my truth about them and saying, hey, yeah, you said something right there that just really pissed me off. And I just want to understand, were you trying to piss me off? Or was it my perception of you? My perception of your story or what you're saying? Because we make it about us. And instead of just asking for clarity, we start to judge and assume we know their intentions. And then it gets all muddled and it gets all messed up. And then that person, like you, Cindy, is like, what did I do? Did I do something to get them to quit? And sometimes it's just yeah, maybe it was that you empowered them so much that they were like, wow, I get to create my own business. Because Cindy was such a great boss that she empowered me and she saw my greatness. And it helped me to find the courage to step into my truth, and sometimes that's all it is. But we want to sit there and going, oh, this person quit. I must have done something wrong. Like, what's wrong with me? I can't keep anybody. Like I hear Shanda, she's one of our coaches and trainers in this room, Shanda Supner. She often talks about how high turnover she has in her place. But it's including her nanny. Like, her nanny always ended up starts a nanny company, like a business. All these people end up like moving into their leadership and creating magic from just being around someone who sees them in that light and empowers them instead of assuming and perception. And she's the kind of person who is just going to call it out how it is. Not from a place of, hey, I'm going to ridicule you or make you feel bad. It's about empowerment and it's about being truth. I say, hey, this is how you're showing up. Is this who you want to be? Cool. And there's power to that. There's power in showing up. And sometimes, like, I love what she says about, you're not going to like me. I'm not here to be liked. I am not here to be liked. I'm here to be honest and I'm here to be, and I love that. And that's a page from her book that I'm definitely taking because I've always been one of those people who push the envelope a little because I hold my emotions in my sleeve. I'm not a very good actress. I try not to be anyway. I was like, I want you to know how I feel. I don't want you to guess what I'm feeling. But I was doing it in a way that wasn't. I think that even though I was in my truth and I was being vulnerable and I was like, hey, this is my truth, there was some manipulation there before. Because I felt like, well, you're gonna know that I'm pissed. I'm gonna be pissed. I'm gonna give you the cultural, and oh my gosh, I'm gonna be pissed. I'm gonna be so pissed. I'm gonna be such a brat. And like creating disconnect, distrust. I wasn't creating connection, and I kept wondering why I'm alone and nobody wants me. Nobody answers the phone when I call, and I'm wondering why I don't have friends, and I'm wondering all these things that which are just making me feel even more and more like, oh, I suck. I don't want to be vulnerable. I don't want to be vulnerable because then I look weak. Or I don't want to be vulnerable because then that person's going to know this about me and they're going to hold it against me. And unfortunately, I find myself realizing just how I created a disconnect with my group, and now I'm like trying back. I'm like, I love you, I love you, my friend. Can you call me? And then it's almost not desperation, but it's coming from a place of, oh my gosh, I have a lot of shit to clean up. And so just coming and being vulnerable with them and saying, hey, I realize that I was disconnected for so many years. Did you know I was depressed? Not that's my story, but like I was feeling not worthy of your friendship. I was feeling like I was showing up sucky for you. And then you know what's going to be beautiful is that when they say, oh my gosh, I had no idea. You haven't been showing like that for me. You're awesome. You're always like so positive. You're funny. It's like you light up a room when you come in the room. I'm like, I do? Really? That's how you see me? And so when I started getting feedback from the people in my group and in the leadership containers, I was like, really? That's me? I was like, I get to start listening at how people are experiencing me in this positive light instead of believing the negativity for so many years of who I thought I was, how I was showing up because of my own limiting beliefs. And it took me being vulnerable to get here, right? Because I recognize now how I was showing up and in the light that I was showing up. And I was like, oh, I can shift that now. But it took me going in and doing the work and like you guys doing the work and talking to you guys and what worked for you and what didn't work for you. Because when you share, Sarah, and Cindy, when you share, and Jen, when you shared last week, all the things that you share, it's something that I've either heard before or hadn't heard before. I didn't hear it in that way. Or maybe you used a couple words, or maybe it was compiled with everything else that was said that day, and all of a sudden it lands. And I'm like, oh, I have a shift. I have an identity shift all of a sudden. And that's because we kept it open and we started the conversation. And so many times it just takes the one person to start the conversation, to be vulnerable enough and say, hey, there's something on my heart that I think that could benefit many people if we just sat in the room and talked and spoke our truth and allowed ourselves to be in a vulnerable place because we see the value there. We see the change and growth that happens when you sit in it. And it's uncomfortable, it's not pretty, and like Beth was talking about the snot and all that stuff. Yeah, it looks ugly. It looks ugly, but the beautiful part is that after is so much more light. The weight has been taken off. The freedom that I found, that I feel, the connection to myself. And because I'm connected to myself, I'm experiencing connection everywhere else. And it's so funny because it's the first year my sister-in-law, in 24 years of being with my husband and coming to Maine every year, it's the first time my sister-in-law is inviting us over for dinner at her house. And it's so funny because it's like we've never been invited over to her house. We just show up because we want to see our nephews and we want to see them and we want to say hi. And they're busy, they're super busy people. They do a lot of service work too. So they're like just always everywhere. And she's a teacher, so super busy. And then I couldn't help but think that was a direct shift because of the shifts I've been making inside myself. So even though I don't have a direct connection to her inviting us, like I can't help but think like if I hadn't started creating connection within myself and the people, that maybe this wouldn't have happened. But it was just coincidentally the same year that I just a week ago had this complete breakdown to breakthrough. You know, where I came to my mother-in-law in front of my children and I was just like, I'm sorry, I'm so responsible for being showing up in selfishness and I created connection and love and understanding in that moment and then like 2 days later, I find out I'm getting invited to dinner. I was like, wow. So I want to invite everybody to consider that. Consider if there's an aspect in your life that's not necessarily going or showing up in the light that you know is possible, that just get curious as to how if it's something you're showing up. Because how you do one thing is how you do everything. And if you want love, you give love. If you want connection, you are connected. And so that's what I'm experiencing now. Does anybody have anything on that they can enlighten and share? Yes, Jen.
Well, I just wanted to say that we are our own worst critics, right? Like we make everything way worse in our head when we just don't let it out. Just like Henry was talking about with males, like they're taught to suppress their emotions. Well, females are too. We're told we're too emotional, that we need to calm down, which is like a trigger word for me, but like I feel like we think that our emotions, like we're on this island by ourselves, thinking that nobody else is going through the same things that we're going through. So we're afraid to share, or females too, like we're judged quite a bit on the way we talk, the way we look, how we show up, and we're picked apart. So we don't want to show that vulnerability for fear of being picked apart out in public. Like it goes back to all the way back to, like witch hunts, because you have a certain opinion about something and you'll be burned. So really just knowing that there is somebody else out there that's going through the same things that you are creates such a big connection. Like just sharing that so that people can really feel that connection to you, to be like, oh, I'm not the only one. And Sarah, I just wanted to validate you too. Like I did not know my emotions at all. Like when I came into this, like I would share things that would happen to me or had happened to me, my stories, right? But I didn't know that it was from fear or sadness. Like I couldn't pinpoint it. But to really get in touch with yourself, like the, even with you, like the fibromyalgia, you're told that that's a fake disease, right? Like you're not being validated. So you really showing up and being vulnerable and sharing your story with other people, like that takes guts. That's amazing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I received that.
See, guys, there's power and magic in showing up for yourself. Like, stop showing up for other people. Show up for yourself. How have you been showing up for yourselves, ladies? Since your containers, like how different do you show up for yourself now? Do you look in? Do you stay in the story? Do you recognize the story? Do you shift? How do you shift from the story and allow yourself to be vulnerable? Does anybody have like a technique or something that a process that they go through to allow themselves to sit in the vulnerability to get to what's underneath and to hone into your feelings?
don't know if mine. So just so everybody knows, and Jen may already know this, but I think we've probably talked about it. I went to HCL not knowing what I was going to HCL for. So
And by the
I
way,
had
guys,
actually,
it's hardcore leadership. I just wanted to say what HCL was for those who are listening. Go ahead, Cindy.
yeah, so I had actually applied for a job and they kept bringing up HCL, HCL, and I'm like, oh, I guess I'll go to HCL. Okay. Not even knowing what I was actually getting into. So I went into this space and I'm like, oh, I don't know if I should be here because this is not what I intended. This is not, what I was expecting. So, but I stuck it out. Well, I love leadership. I love growth. I love, and I figured there's always something to learn. Always something to learn. So I stuck it out. But some of the things didn't apply to me. So I was always trying to find what can I take away from this? And what I got from that, and my buddy who, she didn't finish with us, but I still stayed connected with her, was I didn't have true connections. And I think we talked about very early on is my circle is very small and who I'm vulnerable with is very small. So what I really focused on was connection and keeping those connections. I may be really good, at the holidays of making sure I reach out, I, say my thank yous and I'm grateful for you. But staying connected for the whole year and maintaining those relationships at that higher level was something I didn't do well, and asking myself why. And I had 100 excuses. I'm busy. I work multiple jobs. I have my kids. I have my family. But I always had time to do other things. I could binge watch Netflix. I could, do 100 things. But staying connected with people was not something I did well. So I think what really changed for me is figuring out why. And relationships, they can take and be very time consuming. But then I had to turn, why was it so time consuming? Because it should be a give and take. But I had surrounded myself with people that would continually take. So more of my connecting with them was just to follow up to see how they were doing versus having a true relationship between two people or a group of people. So for me, connection was really what I got from it, and learning how to connect and when to stay connected and how often that connection needs to occur. Does a connection every week have to happen with somebody? No, maybe it's more comfortable once a month, but maintaining and keeping those relationships active and alive and for the right purpose, I think was really what it came for me and my shift this year.
That's beautiful. Have you seen a growth in your connections since then? Because now it sounds like you're nurturing, which is what we get to all think about how we're nurturing our relationships. But yeah, how is that looking for you now?
I spend probably a lot more time on conversations than I do watching Netflix, but it's not a bad thing. I have to really pay attention. And I think, Margarita, you and I were talking, when I did my first summit, I didn't know how to communicate with people outside of a professional conversation. So I think when we talk about connection and being with people, it's really learning how to connect with them at a deeper level than a work level. I will also say I work with my team members on a lot more personal level. So not only do I, coach them in business, I coach them personally too. So I've gotten into a space where I've allowed myself, kind of like, okay, work is work, personal is personal. And I always kept with my employees and myself a distant, and realizing that's not helping anybody. So learning to connect at both levels, you really get a really cohesive relationship, and it's beneficial to everybody. It's beneficial to me because I can see things very quickly if they need help, and it's beneficial to them because they don't feel like they have to immediately turn off or be fired. So I think just the connection and understanding and empathy that comes with it, I think it's just full circle. So the growth for me is I've learned how to communicate and be connected, not only professionally, but personally. And I can have the conversations outside of work and summits and interview people at a much deeper level, which I wasn't able to do up until recently. And it's funny because as a child, I had 6 scholarships in journalism and I didn't take any of them, but I used to be too flowery, too wordy, too this. And then I went to the complete extreme and stayed in that space. So trying to come back, the journey back to me, it has really taken place of, once again, you don't know when you've lost yourself until you're dealing with something and realize, wow, I really lost myself and I had no idea. So I'm not sure if that really answered your question. It was probably very long-winded, but when I think about it, that is, I learned how to recommunicate, which helps with connection.
Yeah, what I heard was your intention. Your intention was to create connection and to journey back to yourself of finding the balance. Yeah, learning, like, and getting curious and asking the questions. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very good. The intention. That's exactly it.
Yeah. Anything for you, Sarah, that came up?
Yeah, so the techniques and stuff that I have just with allowing myself to be vulnerable, and so far, like, my experience is that, like, when I'm in my head and constantly analyzing and just going back and forth, like, oh, do I say something, do I not say something, or like, is this really how I feel, or like, oh, how am I feeling, or being like, oh, I don't know, and just being dismissive of my feelings. And that's all in my head. That's all in my head. So I have this technique that really allows me to be connected with myself. And it's deep breathing. It's part of a deep breathing. So actually, if you guys don't mind, I'd love to invite you all to do this with me, and I can walk you through my technique, and I'd love to get feedback and how you feel and everything about that, if you're open to it.
Please. I would love that.
Yeah, I don't know how long it's going to be, but I do have to drop off. I have a hard stop, but I will stay on until my time.
Really quick. Okay. So I invite you to close your eyes and place both hands on your heart. And by placing both hands on our heart, it's a physical sign of us directly connecting to our heart. And now let's take a deep breath in and hold and breathe out. And again, we're going to breathe in and hold. And before we let out, we're going to let out slowly, but also clear our minds. And one more time, we're focusing on clearing our minds and dropping into our hearts. Breathing in and hold and breathe out. And when you're ready, open your eyes and come back. And so that's the process that I take, and I keep my hands on my heart the entire time. And it brings so much clarity because I'm focusing on clearing my mind and focusing on what's coming up on my heart, and being connected to my heart. And it allows me to kind of like get rid of the garble that's going on up here and drop into authenticity and connection and clarity of how I'm feeling. And then I'm really able to be like, oh, wow, I'm actually feeling sad, or oh, I'm feeling confused, or well, maybe confusion's not. Confusion I use as kind of like a as a way of avoiding what I'm feeling. But I'd love to hear from both of you, like what came up for you in that process and how did that feel?
I am a constant breather. I use it at night when I can't go to sleep. I have 100 things on my mind. So I use the breathing techniques there. I also suffer from anxiety and panic attacks. So breathing has always been one of those things. I don't take medication. Anyone who knows me knows even though I work in healthcare, I look for natural ways to handle things. So I don't take medication. I always try to get right with my mind on my own. And breathing is one of those ways that I do that. So I I am a believer. I believe it helps, and I believe it really centers you.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I was able to drop into my heart and I could see how connected that allowed me to be with myself, right? It's like just releasing the thoughts, releasing that monkey mind, as we call it. Um, and then being intentional about dropping into the heart, right? Bringing the awareness down there and then just getting curious of what's coming up. And so for me, yeah, there was very interesting things that came up for me. I'm like, I wonder why I'm feeling that today. So thank you for that. But through what I'm noticing though is that it sounds like you, both of you, and Jen and Beth, you guys are all using, and I know Coach Henry also does breath work. I think Beth is his coach actually. And that has been something that I noticed when I started doing breath work, that I was having a lot of frustration and anger coming up. Like, why do I feel really angry or frustrated right now doing this breath work? And it was because I had so much resentment stored in my body, so much anger that I was storing up in my body. So when I was going through the breath work, even when I was getting deep tissue massages, I was like, stop touching me. Because it was that they were going deep into the muscles where emotions can be stored in certain parts of your body. And I was just like, wow, I didn't realize I was holding on. So what's interesting about that, and the reason why I bring it up is because having that be something that is coming up with deep work with it, which is also breath work. I'm like, wow, no wonder why I became the angry drunk. I had so much of that emotions in me and resentment. And I was like, well, who am I angry at? Right? Because then it gets okay, I have the awareness. It's not enough just to have the awareness. Like get vulnerable and finding out why I'm angry. Am I angry at somebody else? Am I angry at the world? Am I angry at myself? And yeah, I realized I was holding on to a lot of resentments of what I thought should have been my experience of my growing up in my childhood, what should have been my experience with my mom, what should have, all these expectations and perceptions. But one of the things I realized going through this process is that my mom is just like me. I'm just like my mom. She also is disconnected with who she is, hasn't gone intimately with herself to understand. Instead of being angry and mad, I'm like, oh, I see her as this hurt, scared little girl too. And that gave me so much compassion for her. And I was able to forgive all those things that I was holding against her, thinking that she was doing it to me on purpose, thinking that she hates me, thinking that I am a burden. And in reality, I was showing up in a way that was difficult for her. Because I think, Cindy, you said it earlier too about, parenting and how we can sometimes project, the issues that we're trying to also break ourselves, right? Unbeknownst that we don't realize that we're I recognize that I've been operating from that limiting belief as a parent. Like my kid over here asking me for a million things, I lose my mind because I have my own perception of it, my own beliefs around it. But she's just a kid, being a kid, being what she would be doing, and I'm telling her how she's wrong when it's really not about her. It's all about me and how I am. in my life in that moment. And so I've allowed myself to be vulnerable and sharing with her, hey, babe, I'm really sorry when you did this and I did that. I just want you to know that that wasn't about you. I want you to know that mommy had a really tough day today and that triggered me because of this thing. And it's not about you. And I want you to know I love you unconditionally. It wasn't your fault for me losing my mind. I'm sorry. It was just a bad day. And when I started doing that with my kids, I started noticing that they were being responsible and vulnerable coming up to me. Being responsible for how they showed up or for, being rude or yelling or, wanting to fight with me, and I was like, oh my God, that's so beautiful. But I created that because she saw what vulnerability looks like and that it was safe. And that's where we get to start. We get to start modeling for ourselves before we want to implement it on our children, because the children will pick it up. They're going to be conditioned and modeling you anyway, the good and the bad. So I realize I get to shift now, like what it looks like. And so me coming out and speaking in front of my mother-in-law and my children and not just having it be an adult conversation, they saw me as a person that is not perfect, that is flawed, but is willing to come and be responsible and take ownership for the shit. Instead of just it being the elephant in the room that I ignore and avoid, because that's my biggest nerd. I avoid everything. Just like you said, confusion. Yeah, I was going to call you out, Sarah. I'm glad you called yourself out on that one. Because it's true. Like how many, sometimes we pretend we don't know when we do know. We pretend so much we don't know. And that's just us not being willing to be vulnerable with what we might encounter or uncover. So I am going to bring this call to an end, because honestly, what came to my mind, went in my heart, is that I really want to connect with my family today. And I want to thank them for giving me so many chances to show up in my light and allowing me to be vulnerable with them and loving me and seeing me. Because I know that up until now, there were moments when I wasn't showing up in my true light because I had a story around it, and I didn't think I was good enough to show up as me. So I was showing up as somebody else, which was creating disconnect, distrust. It was creating fights, but it took me loving myself to understand that is who I truly am. And then when I show up in myself, people can't help but to fall in love with me. Because it's like, how can you hate someone who's like coming to you in their vulnerability and their honesty and saying, hey, and not being condescending and not being hurtful, right? Because you're accepting of yourself in that moment. And so when you show up that way, it's just the natural thing that happens. It creates connection, it creates love, and it creates a space where people say, wow, thank you. They feel honored even sometimes. Like I know I felt honored when people were able to share their truths with me. And I was like, wow, there must be something that you see in me that gives you that. And I think a lot of it is because I'm willing to go there. I'm willing to go deep and get vulnerable and say, hey, I don't have it figured out either, mama, but let's do this together. Let's hold each other's hand because we rise together. You can't rise alone. And this is why I'm doing this and being in this room and just saying, hey, you have beautiful story of healing. You have a beautiful story of reconnecting and learning balance in your life. Henry is learning how, to show up as himself and his vulnerability, and knowing that he doesn't have to save a woman. He just has to save himself. And Beth understanding that going in deep in her vulnerable state allowed her to find breath work, which was what helped heal her, that is healing her in a space, right? But it wasn't until the common thread I'm hearing is that we all went and got vulnerable with ourselves and intimate Into me you see. Well, thank you for presencing that, Cindy. Into me see, into me you see. And when you let people in, when you let people really in and seeing you and being honest with your feelings and naming them, Sarah, I'm sure you've gotten really good at naming them now, right? And expressing
It's a
them.
work in process.
It's still, but you're getting better because you're willing to go and try it out. Nothing is going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
We wish breakthroughs happen overnight, but it's still an ongoing process. Like I felt like I've had so many breakthroughs, but that wall keeps coming up again. Oh, just an opportunity. There must be something still here. That is my blind spot. But when you start operating from a place of understanding, grace, and just giving yourself love. Grace is the biggest word. I'm like, I'm still not keeping my word to myself, and I tell myself every time, well, I get to have grace because the self beat up is just gonna make me spiral. But I also get to get underneath it. Like, what is it that I'm saying about myself? Why am I not keeping my word? At the same time as I'm giving myself grace, I'm also getting on my ass and going, hey, when are you gonna stop it? When is your story gonna finally, like what you said, Sarah, was so beautiful. Your vision for being pain free was way bigger than your need for holding on to your story.
Yeah.
Your need for holding on to what you up until then thought was your identity.
Oh yeah.
And that's a great reminder for all of us. Yeah. It's not easy, but it is at the same time. It just takes work and dedication and consistency. Being consistent. So I just want to honor you and say thank you so much for showing up in your truth and in your vulnerability. And Cindy, the reminder of choosing who to be vulnerable with, because I feel like sometimes it's so easy for me to want to share my vulnerability. But I also realize, Sarah, I'm sharing my story, not how I feel about it. So thank you for presencing that for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, I love it. I love that I get to really focus on who I'm willing to really get vulnerable with instead of trying to be vulnerable with everyone. Like, who am I really going to really be deep and vulnerable with? And those are the people that I get to create connection with and love and trust and safety so that they can also feel the same. So thank you, ladies. I honor you and I see you and I thank you so much for being here today. And Sao Bona, may you pay it forward always and keep showing up.
Thank you.